Okay, so I have both of our base panels out of the clamps now and I'm ready to move on to a stage that I've been really excited for. So one of the main reasons I wanted a drum sander was to flatten frame and panels like this. Because on things like the Craftsman pie cupboard that I built a while back and the maple dresser, the drawer bottoms on both of those were made with a frame and panel design, and I had to hand sand them to get them flat, and then I had to cut the joinery after that, which worked for the most part, but there was some inconsistencies to it. Whereas with the drum sander now, I can fully flatten both of these panels on both sides, get a perfectly flat panel, and have it all nicely sanded up to a nice high enough grit. So on the drum sander right now, I'm just going to be using 80 grit to knock down the surface layer of this until I get it to a stage where it's going to fit in the bottom of the two cases. And so I'm not going to go any higher than 80 grit on the drum sander just because I don't think that there's a need to. I don't need to fully sand these to be all beautifully smooth on the drum sander because it's just a lot of effort to change out the belts on the drum sander for something that's going to be much easier to hit with the random orbit sander quickly. And so once we have these all nice and flattened through the drum sander, we can then install them in the bottom of the cases and they will be all ready to go. And so like I said, this is one of the big reasons why I wanted a drum sander, not just for the sanding abilities and finishing parts up like we did earlier in this project, but for stuff like this. This is a capability that I haven't had before to nicely clean up panels like this that need to be kept fairly flat. And in this case, we'll be able to make them pretty much perfectly flat. It also works great for cleaning up a lot of the stupidity of my super cheap planer. My planer is not good. The Ridge makes an absolutely horrible planer in my opinion. The rubber rollers jam up and leave marks. The knives are iffy at that. So everything about it, it's not a super good planer. But the drum sander is going to let me fix all the issues that the planer leaves because we got a lot of track marks from the planer. We've got burning, we've got rubber marks. All this horrible, horrible stuff that the planer leaves. By passing this through the drum sander, we're going to clean up and get rid of all of that really quickly. Now, the one trick with the drum sander is that on these cross-grain pieces up here, we are going to get some lines going through there. If you go to a high enough grit on the drum sander, it usually cleans up those for the most part. But then, I think the highest I've gone on my drum sander was up to 120 grit all over cross-grain. And then taking a 150 grit random orbit sander over that cleans them up perfectly. Then you just jump up to 180 grit with the random orbit sander and everything is perfect. And so the whole purpose of the drum sander is not to leave your piece kind of perfectly finished ready. That's not what it's designed for. That's not its job. The purpose of the drum sander is to get things to that grit. So if your goal is to get things up to 180 grit, then you can sand going belt by belt by belt on the drum sander up to 180 grit. Then you're going to want to finish off with either a hand sanding or a random orbit sander. And so anytime you have cross-grain pieces, it's just going to be a little bit of a nightmare in general in woodworking because if I was to hand sand this whole thing, I'd get the same lines going across here anyway. So on a piece like this, you're always going to have to use a random orbit sander because that's just going to give you the best result overall. Okay, so here is a perfect example for the hybrid approach to woodworking. Those of you that watch The Wood Whisperer know exactly what I'm talking about. So we flattened this whole panel using the drum sander and it came out perfectly flat. Except the only problem is on our case here, we have the two bottom runners that are actually supporting the shelf and there's no guarantee that they are perfectly flat and perfectly in line with each other. They can be a little bit tilted from each other and there can be skews across the whole plane of the bottom of the case here. So one of the issues that you have if you only use machinery is that everything needs to come out perfectly square, perfectly aligned. There can't be any issues. You can make some minor corrections here and there with machinery, but in general, you need to have your stuff nearly perfect. Whereas if you use a hybrid method, you can do a lot of the brute work. So we did all the flattening and got this panel to a 99% flat stage off the drum sander. Then on my one side where I had a little bit of tip to it, this front right corner here was a little bit too high. I could go in and clean that up with my hand plane and get a perfect fitting base into this case here. So off the machinery, there was a little bit of rock to it. It wasn't exactly perfect. After making a few passes with the hand plane here, I was able to get this thing sitting perfectly flat in there without any wobble, and it is still sitting nice and flat. We've got the front edge all nicely aligned. Everything is pretty much perfect, as best as I want it to be. And so the only thing we have left to do on the base panel here is to actually sand it up to our final grit. Right now it's at 80 grit out of the drum sander, and it feels rough to the touch like most of the time 80 grit does. If we were to try and put oil on this, it would just soak up about twice as much oil as we want it to, so that's not good. Alright, so I've got all the drawer slides installed on our right case here that's going to have all the drawer sections in it. And so as you can see, there's 4 drawers in here and a total of 6 of the slides, and then we have the base panel that makes up the bottom section. So I figured I should stop and explain what the heck is going on with these drawer slides because they are something a little bit different than you might have seen in a lot of other videos. So the way that I'm working this is I want to do a traditional style drawer, an all wooden drawer, because I don't quite have the confidence yet to work with metal drawer slides. Now, metal drawer slides are a little bit more expensive, but I do think they have some benefits, and there's something that I'm going to work towards making and putting into my projects, because I think realistically, if you're going to sell a piece of furniture, you should have metal ball bearing drawer slides in there, just because it's a little bit better. Again, for high-end expensive furniture, having metal drawer slides is a little bit more professional. But for me personally, I really love the feeling of well-made wooden drawers. So this is things like the pie cupboard. I really like the way I got the drawers done on there. They slide in and out super easily because I managed to slick up all the surfaces, and they work really nicely. On the dresser, they work really nicely too. That maple dresser, those drawers slide super easily, even when loaded with clothing. And I think even on the walnut tea cabinet, one of the first projects I did on here, those drawers, again, work really nicely, and they're just all wood construction. And so the only place where metal drawer slides are really going to be more of an advantage is if you're dealing with really heavy stuff in the drawers. So things like really large dressers, you're going to want metal drawer slides because they need to alleviate some of that weight that's in those drawers. So for these drawer slides, you can see that there's actually quite a bit going on here. So I started with a piece that was 18 and about 5/16 long. Depends on which case you're going with. I think this one is 18 and 3/16. This one's 18 and 5/16. And the drawer slides are going just before the ending where we have the door in the backside there. So they're bumping basically right up against there, just below the bevel like we've done everywhere else on here. So then the goal of these drawer slides is that I need to create something for the drawer to sit on, which is this bottom section here, and something for the drawer side to ride against. And so because we have a gap between our side panels and our front legs, we need to create something so that the drawer isn't fishtailing as it tries to come out of the opening. Because as soon as you have a wooden drawer and it starts to fishtail like that, that's when they get jammed super easily. A loose-fitting wooden drawer is usually the worst possible thing that can happen. So by creating these slides on the side, this is going to create a nice tight opening where our drawer is not going to easily be able to get knocked to one side or the other. And so I added this rabbet onto the edge here that then creates that back piece that we need to support the drawer. That piece also goes down about 1/4 of an inch. And the reason it's specifically 1/4 of an inch is because these pieces are 7/8 of an inch. We don't want this bottom of the section here to be riding against the drawer below it. Again, you could do that if you wanted to so that you have something to stop this drawer from tipping upwards in the back end, but I'm not too worried about that. And what I find is really nice, and I discovered this on the Craftsman pie cover, is when you can pull wooden drawers out and then let them drop a little bit, that lets them lock in place so that if you have to, if you need to leave the drawer open for some reason, it holds it and locks it in place rather than having to constantly pull it in and push it back in because it's just kind of unstable sitting there. So being able to let it drop just a little bit nicely locks it in place, and it's kind of a useful thing. The next important thing with these slides is the holes that I have going along here. We've got 4 holes to go in each one of our vertical dividers here. And with these holes, I made sure that they are clearance holes. Now what a clearance hole means is that when you can put the screw in and it has room to wiggle and move around. The reason for this is nothing to do with wood movement or anything, but I guess technically, yes, it would help with wood movement, but it's purely because you're never going to line these drawer slides absolutely perfect with the holes that you drill in here. So if you have a clearance hole in your sliders here, it lets you have just a little bit of wiggle room to perfectly align your drawer slides. And so mounting these drawer slides is actually a fairly simple process. So the important thing you need to remember is that you're not trying to align them with the angle of these front bars here, because there's no guarantee that those front bars are perfectly square and perpendicular to our front supports here. So when you're building a case like this, you as the builder need to define what is going to be the square thing. So for me, I said that this front post is what I want to be square. I want the drawer to slide in and out perfectly in line with this, and it should be square according to these post legs because I know that they're the most accurate thing on here. So with your square, you should have one that has edges on both sides that I can reference up against there. You then want to drop your square down so it's resting on one of your bars. Again, you're probably going to notice some gaps between the square and areas of this front bar because there's no guarantee that it's perfectly aligned on there. It's just part of woodworking. Again, the mortiser doesn't do a great job of getting nice mortisers in there. I also had fairly loose tendons, so they drooped and moved around a little bit. So there are going to be some visible gaps in there. But what you want is for the square to be tight up against the post leg here and pointing straight back. And I should mention you want to do all this with the case lying down because it's just easier not to fight against gravity. Then once you have all that in place, you can throw a clamp on here like you guys saw me do earlier, and that will hold the square locked in place, so then you can push the drawer slide up against that square and really get it into the perfect position possible. From there, because we're using clearance holes, you want to go up to a slightly larger bit than you would use normally to drill these out. So to drill the actual holes for the screws, I'm using a 5/32 brad point bit, but to mark the location, I'm using a 3/16 bit because this fits better into our clearance hole. Again, this has a little bit of movement room in that clearance hole just to make sure that I can drop it in easily, but that's the idea that you're going for, is you want to make sure that you're using a bit that is closer in size to the clearance hole so you're getting a more accurate alignment and positioning. Then once you've marked your holes, you obviously want to take the drawer slide out, go in, drill it out with a drill, and again, you got to be very careful not to punch through your outside here. So I like to use green masking tape or anything really works. Now, one thing I will mention is that it is very likely that on your first one you do, you're going to screw it up. And if you screw up the placement and it comes out not square at all, there's a very simple trick that I've learned to fix that issue without really causing any big problems. So the trick is to fix it with a dowel plug. So all you need to do is go to your smallest dowel size or closest dowel size to that hole. So I can make 3/16 dowels, as you guys have seen on the rest of this thing here. 3/16 dowels are something I just kind of have laying around in my shop. So all I have to do is throw a 3/16 bit into my drill, widen out those holes where I messed up, glue in a piece of dowel, let it cure for 1 to 2 hours, make sure it's nice and hard in there, and then you can go back in and re-drill your holes in the proper location. And you can do this as many times as you need. If you keep screwing up constantly, it's a really good way to learn. You just have to keep patching those holes because it's not going to become any weaker by having a bunch of little pieces of dowel in there. As long as you're making sure you fill those holes, that's the important thing. You don't want to leave empty holes in your case here because that's going to create small weaknesses. If you can fill them with a dowel, that's ideal. So with the square still mounted, you can go in and push the slide up against the square, drop in your screws. They should start to seat into the holes that you already pre-drilled, and then you can just tighten them up and you should be good to go. And I've gone through, checked all my slides on here, and they are pretty much perfect, as good as I would expect them to be for wooden drawer slides. And so there's still a lot of work I have to do on these drawer slides. I still have to go in and make sure this track here is perfectly smooth so the drawer doesn't get caught up on anything. So I'm going to be sanding in here up to 220 grit, and then giving it a good coating of paste wax to make sure it's nice and slippery. And that's really all it takes to make nice wooden drawer slides.